Thank you. And thank you all for coming in the final hours of the Tech Lab. So these are the diehards who are with me today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our 10-year journey into Europe in sharing threat intelligence. And as you may know, in the upper left there's a TLP notification, because what I'll be sharing is a bit sensitive sometimes. So in that sense, please observe that notification. So a little bit of background. I'm used to be with Ethos, before that with Accenture, now an independent advisor to public and private sector. Also finishing up a PhD, and in this event I'm the chairman of the Connected Trust Foundation, which is at the moment one of the biggest multinational cross-sectoral NGOs in Europe sharing threat intelligence, who has been designated by government. So we are government appointed by the Dutch government in partnerships with several others. So we're a trusted NGO to be between government and recipients of threat intelligence. So we get it from government as well as from other sources. So financially independent, so we're not government funded, so we create our own funding, and we specifically target mature organizations regardless of which country they are headquartered. So whether it's a Dutch one or it's a French one or a Belgian one, we cover the organization as opposed to many of the European regulations who specifically focus on the headquarter and not the legal owner. So we have an ownership structure within our clients. So we're all about automation. However, between automation and getting into action, there's a person, usually. Sometimes there's just a machine, but if there's a person, we want to keep them involved as well, which are not just the CISOs, but are also the young professionals who are in the security operations centers doing the work. So what are we talking about is our 10-year journey, and we are currently starting in 2015 as just an informal thing. So we just came together, a couple of founders. I was not even that part of the foundation, because we started thinking, why is the threat intelligence sharing always done by sector? Well, it makes sense to do it by sector. However, translating the intelligence into an action is not sector dependent, it is technology dependent. If you have the same FortiGate vulnerability, you need to be in contact with other organizations who are having the same problem, whether how they automate it or whether how they actually execute the action. So we started out with a number of sectors. We started in the best possible way. We started in the bar, which is a very good way to start with trust. So that's where we started out. And it was just a number of meetings we had along the way. So in 2018, they decided to switch from informal to formal, because we found that much of the attention, especially in the political domain, was all around, am I getting the information regardless of my status? Am I critical infrastructure or not? Am I in a specific sector who has organized it differently or not? And they said, well, we see too much attention going into the threat intelligence itself, and too little attention in how to translate the CTI into a proper action. So we became a foundation, an NGO, and we said, well, we're going to do a couple of things. First, we're going to become political. So that means we, as the board, started to interact with government, including the lobbyists, so we became in the political domain more present to challenge the status quo with regards to information sharing. And keep in mind, this is in between the NIS 1 and NIS 2. So we also became a little bit more active in the European space as well. Secondly, we said, well, we found that within many organizations, especially the large mature one, the processes in getting it actually done were not even in place. So we said, we're going to give you one small feed. So we got in touch with Circle here at the Luxembourg stand, who provided us with their MISP environment, and we said, well, you just focus on one single feed and translating that into an action. We'll make sure that we work along with you. Second one, we had the team from the Dutch Institute for Vulnerability Disclosures, who were sort of created at the same time we became an NGO. So informally we're already there. And that was a very interesting combination, because you have then the researchers finding the vulnerability, and you have the sharing entity who is making sure it's being delivered to an organization, and both are in close contact with the national government. So that's a very good triage to have. So that became our first feed. So you see it's now a bit of an empty slide as we go along. Across the 30 minutes, it will become fuller and fuller as we go along. So our efforts helped in becoming political because in 2021 we officially were appointed. And that means that we got a letter from the Minister of Justice saying, you are a trusted NGO who you can collaborate with. So that was for us a special status because that also allowed us to build more partnerships. It also led to us getting the first governmental feeds in, which turned out to be a bit of a nightmare, to be honest. Because the Dutch government, and I think that's typical for any government, any national cybersecurity, always chooses time over quality. So that means they're sharing as quickly as possible. That means that all the trouble we have from the different formats becomes our problem. And still to this day we have cases where suddenly a government adds a new source and that CSV suddenly becomes a comma instead of a dot comma. And you get a lot of error messages and you need to solve that all over again. So we found there's a lot of work in actually getting that organized. The other one is that we said, well, we want to share it automatically. So we don't like email, to be honest. We want to have it in an automated way. Interestingly enough, with the exception of some people logging into MISP, but it wasn't used that much, everything else was done by email. Everybody wants it by email still. So there's a concern on our end. So we do have a collaboration environment where we're putting it in as sort of an archiving purposes. But yes, this is most of the organizations, and these are all the large mature ones, still get it by email. And then in 2021, it became a bit nasty for us. Because this is, for the ones who remember this is the Kaseya vulnerability, July 2021, found in this case by the Dutch Institute for Vulnerability Disclosure. However, it was used, misused by a Russian criminal actor called Revil, just one day before the update was released by the software vendor. So that means that many organizations were left vulnerable. However, since this was our partner on the researching end, we got the information a bit sooner. So that meant that we could share it a bit sooner before even the update was officially released. We knew the pre-release. So the result was that Connected Trust was found by Revil as well. So then you become the target as a sharing organization as well, which means we were DDoSed. They tried to get into our threat sharing platform. They didn't get in. However, we did find it an interesting experiment because it made us go a little bit dark, I would say. So we're also known in the Netherlands, even though we have around 2,000, 2,500 organizations in Europe we're covering. We're what we say we're a best kept secret. We don't want to be in the public press, so this is one of the few chances we have to actually tell you a little bit about us. We also said, well, maybe we need to be a bit more closer to the government if we really want to protect ourselves again. So we got two more partnerships in, one with the police, the Dutch police, the other one with CISA from the US. At that time, the Biden administration, so that's at that time a well-funded organization. Today, we still don't know, but that's more on the geopolitical end. So that became our additional governments working closely with us, providing us with a lot of information. And then we extended our work a little bit beyond the Dutch border. And that had a lot to do with the ICC case in the International Criminal Court being targeted by the United States, where the municipality of The Hague, the location of the ICC, became concerned around the NGOs who are working closely for the ICC. Because it's not just the ICC becoming a victim. We've seen Hate Aid yesterday on stage at the main stage. All those organizations are now can become a target as well. So they said, well, let's see what the status is of the NGO, because they're in a difficult place. They have little money, and they have a very high threat profile. So we worked with Shadow Server, we worked with the Cyber Peace Institute, we reached out to Citizen Lab just to see how do we get the NGO space a bit more safe. And wrote a report, which you can still find on the website of at least CPI and Shadow Server on that status, because the NGOs are in a very poor performance. So they're very vulnerable. IT is not their main business. Money is not their main business, and all the money goes to the welfare and not to their IT systems. And their biggest, and the sad thing here is that the best protected NGOs are those who are using the discount programs of Google, Microsoft, which keeps them safer. However, doesn't keep their continuity going if something goes wrong at the ICC level. In parallel, because we approach this not as an NGO. This was the first time we approached a group as an ecosystem, because all these NGOs are around the ICC, and that became a kind of a new model. So that means at this moment we are also doing the same. We're still doing that with all of the glasshouse farming industry in the Netherlands, all of the safety regions in the Netherlands. So we don't do a single organization anymore. Preferably we do the entire ecosystem. It's not the entire sector. It can be across sectors, but we use what we call the trust is already there. And we find that building trust is more difficult than actually delivering CTI. And if you deliver CTI to a trusted ecosystem, they start helping each other because the soft factors, being the trust, is already there. So that meant we started growing on that end with a little bit of more partnerships with NGOs in addition to the governments we already had. So that's where we were 2023. So we're getting to 2026 already. We're also getting in the space where preparations for the NIS2 came in. So the Netherlands is one of the slower countries in implementing NIS2. We still haven't implemented it. However, we had one organization who actually wanted to test the NIS2 in practice. So this organization is present in 7 countries in Europe. And they ran an incident, a very small incident on a test server, which wasn't patched properly, just to test how the NIS2 mechanisms actually work in Europe. And they found what I would call a very scattered landscape, because the NIS2 not only makes life more difficult for organizations, it also gives more responsibility to government. The assumption is that those governments do the same thing. In reality, governments send conflicting messages. So we've seen cases where the German Bund says something different as opposed to the Dutch Cybersecurity Center, or the Dutch Cybersecurity says something different than the actual software vendor. So they're all assessments being made by national cybersecurity centers. But if you're a country or an organization working in multiple countries, then you have a problem, because that means you're incompliant in at least one country. You have one infrastructure. You either patch or don't patch. If one country says patching and the other one says don't, then what do you actually do? Well, we came sort of entangled in that problem. However, we found one thing, and that's where the knowledge sharing actually kicks in, and I've put it in a small mark to you to take away, because it was the biggest surprise in the test was not that governments are not aligned, because in Europe we've seen that earlier. The biggest challenge in an incident, and keep this in mind please, because it's a worrying thing, the biggest threat in the incident became the insurance company. Because what happens in an incident is that you have to report an incident to your cyber insurance company. And in this case, this was a very, like I said, it was a test server, so it was a small incident. And actually their insurance company came in and demanded global admin, full access to the entire network. And this is an international, a multinational, one of the bigger ones in the Netherlands. And they couldn't prevent it from happening. Legally, they were allowed to have this right to access global admin, which created a new incident. So the incident, instead of remaining very small and a good test, became a global incident, because everybody now had to be informed that there was an external party suddenly demanding global admin. And they fought them with lawyers, they fought them with the CISO. They did not win. So my tip in that small box there is, if you go back, it's not a nice thing to do, as nobody reads the terms and conditions. Read your insurance policy, because there will be this single paragraph in and you want to have it out. Secondly, we also find that the difference in government were not just different, they were also restricting to countries. So the National Cybersecurity Center in the Netherlands is called national for a reason. Organizations, however, are not. So the national thing is nice, but it creates a lot of work, in average around 2 full-time people just doing deduplication. And you can do it with a bit of help of AI, but then you still need somebody monitoring if it's all done correctly. And governments demand compliance. So you can run it through AI, but then you need to have your processing done very, very well. So that became our problem. So we see that we're now in a phase where organizations are saying, well, we have a problem, connected to us, can you solve it? So instead of us trying to get them moving, we're now becoming the owner of many of their problems. And it also meant that we started working across borders, but then you have little use of a national government, because it's national by design. So you then go, as we did earlier, back to the researchers, because they're the only ones. So we have a direct partnership with Shadow Server. We have a direct partnership as well with DVD to actually access the data from the source before it's distributed by country. So again, we sort of go across everything which is needed. However, as you can see in the previous slide, in the end, I'm still ending up with email, which was not our best case because the follow-up was way too small to do something. So we started automation. And that was a bit of a dispute, with Microsoft being the first. Because what we found is if you do automation with something in an Azure environment like Defender or Sentinel, that's not trusted if it comes from a non-Microsoft environment. So until that time, we ran a sovereign solution just from a local European infrastructure. So we actually had to build a specific part in an Azure environment as well to make sure that the Azure clients on our end would actually receive the CTI. We escalated this through Europe on unfair market competition, so we made it very political there as well. The end result is now that technically it can be done. However, Microsoft is on an average 2-3 months delay on documentation. So it means every update which is being run, if we want to make sure the connector stays up and running, we need the documentation, which is so far lagging behind that it's still unfeasible to do it if you're going from outside of Microsoft. So that became another learning point on our end. Second is that we started looking at the generic threat intelligence, because we found that if I'm sharing something specific, it means I have registered from an organization its domains, its IP ranges, its AS numbers, in order to provide the organization with the information specifically for that organization. So that's an easy one. You're getting a trigger from me saying you are now scannable from the outside on this IP address because you didn't patch or update something. However, you want to do the same thing with generic advisory. So if you have an HP printer and you're getting a signal from me, you don't want to have an email with an HP printer. You want your SIM or your technology saying, well, we do have the HP printer, or we don't, and then you can ignore the message. So there's a new format coming for that. It's called the CSAF format. And if you run that properly, you need to actually, it can sort of do that work for you in an automated way. So because it maps you against the CMDB and the SBOM from an organization to see if it's relevant for you or not. However, we decided not to run that on our side because I don't want to know the configuration, the SBOM or CMDB of an organization. They need to do that themselves. So you're seeing that the diagram already gets a bit more complex on the receiving end, because you need a connector running into your SIM. So we run various SIM connectors to make sure it's all running. You need to install a tool, commercial, open source, to make sure you can process a CSAF format. So it's getting more and more complex all the way. So we're in this year, the OT threat matcher. Because we found that if you're using the traditional information CTI sharing mechanisms, they have a taxonomy which is built upon IT. And we've seen many OT industry automation here at INCYBER. However, they are not able to actually process the OT threat intelligence. The taxonomy is built upon IT, so it means there is certain required fields which are in that taxonomy that don't apply for an OT environment. So we decided to build our own. So we're now currently building what we call the OT threat matcher in addition to what we've done on OT. So we're just building the same thing to make sure it's OT applicable. And that we're not doing that on our own, we're doing that together with Germany, with BSI, because they are together with Siemens working on this for quite a while. And especially in the OT domain, you need to have a quick follow-up when it's becoming sensitive. At the same time, we said, well, we're seeing many problems within organizations, especially large ones, to actually just find the information we need to process it. So if I go around and ask my 2,500 organizations, how do you collect the technical data, for example, what's your IP range? Most of them, it's a manual process. It's somewhere in there. And rarely it's complete, so we decided two things. One, we're going to build an open source tool to collect it, so we're doing it together with the Dutch National Cybersecurity Center. And secondly, we are creating our own portal. Why are we creating our own portal? To upload the information to? Because if you're uploading it to the Dutch National Cybersecurity Center, again, it's national only, so it means only one part of your data set will be allowed. The other ones which are registered outside of the Netherlands are not part of that. So you see that we're still building, as we are hitting our 10-year anniversary earlier this week, we're still building on the automation end. However, we have reached a point where we are now becoming more and more known in Europe. Because as we are growing more and bigger in Europe as well, we find that we're getting more closer to the European way going forward. So that means we are extending more and more feeds. So we switched to the EU vulnerability database as source. It means we're also now doing the matching between the CVEs coming in from the EUVD and those which have an advisory as an additional information set on that as well. However, we are now also going into the domain of Stealer logs. So we're now in a project with Europol to work towards a system where you can not just can be informed as an organization that your credentials have been compromised from one of your employees, but we're also working on a system and if you're an e-commerce company where you have an account for your customers, you can run an API to see if it's actually being misused by potentially misused, or it's already in the data set being obtained by a police force. We're moving in that police force domain now, much more to make sure that everybody is informed and can run through the systems ourselves as well. And in the Netherlands, those are two projects known as No More Leaks and Check Your Hack. They're being made European, basically. With funding from Europol and the European Union to enable this. And we're just the distribution partner in between to make sure information in Austria or in France can be reached by the Dutch organization and vice versa. So we're moving in that part as well. And finally, as we are growing bigger and bigger, we are also becoming more and more of a target. We already noticed this with Reveal, so that means me as a person also need to make sure that I'm safe as well. So for that reason, yesterday we signed a partnership with PassGuard here on the front row as well, to actually make sure that we, both my private mail as well as my business email, as well as everything we do, is a bit more protected because I am becoming a target. I have reached the point where I'm being advised maybe not to go to the US unless it's really strictly necessary. So that's where we currently are when you are in this domain. So that means we've reached the final diagram of everything we do. And as you can see, it's what we call our threat matcher platform. So it's not really a platform, it's like a modular-based system where we are currently building as we go along to make sure everything is done automated. And our ambition is that to have within 1 hour time frame between the release of an information and the completion of the action. And if you're an international organization, and those of you who are familiar with them, you know that's not an easy thing. But we do find if you make that such a short time frame as your main goal, you do see very quickly where it's running into a problem. So where are we today? Like I said, we celebrated our 10-year anniversary in a Dutch very special building called Radio Kootwijk. And you can also see we're now in 6 countries. You can see we're in many, many sectors. We haven't covered all of the NIS2 sectors yet. However, we are getting very, very close and growing quickly. So that's why we're happy to be invited here to INCYBER to tell a bit more. So to summarize, 10 years of threat intel sharing from an NGO. One, it's a good thing to have an NGO in between government and recipients because there's no commercial bias, because we're not in it for profit, we're an NGO by any means. Start small before you scale fast. So don't throw all the commercial, all the CTI in it at once, because nobody will actually be able to handle that. Acknowledge that it's different per source and per type. That makes it complex. It can be automated, but if you don't acknowledge it at the start, your engine will fail. Like I said, the more you share, the bigger target you become. Governments may provide inconsistent advisories. That's something to take into account. Like I said, you may be actually becoming non-compliant. However, our biggest concern with governments is not the inconsistency, it's the difference between the number of CVEs coming out and them making an independent risk assessment on which CVE they provide you with an advisories. And we've seen many cases where organizations get an advisory from a government and think all of the advisories is the total number of CVEs. They are not. They are probably the most high-risk ones, but that's an assessment made by a government. The boundaries, organizational, governmental boundaries, they create what I call a digital deficit. So there's always this difference between something which is legally not allowed, and sometimes we say, well, the government needs to abide by the letter of the law. We are an NGO, we abide by the spirit of the law. That sounds a little bit icky, but it's a very small difference which in CTI sharing can make a large impact. Governmental feeds are compliance-driven only. They are not a substitution for commercial feeds. However, they're also not the same. So you need sort of to make sure you cover them both. And finally, as we're seeing now, CTI is becoming very much AI-driven. I think I have not seen any booth here which doesn't have AI, agentic AI, generative AI on it. Same goes for RSA conference last week, as I heard from many people being there. So it does mean the time to respond is getting less. However, the response end on AI is not there yet. Many of the AIs I found here at this conference as well are very much around user support AI. They are not on an AI-driven implementation of an action based upon a feed. The condition to do that is that the feed is actually trusted, independent, without any commercial purpose. And that's where we come in. Questions?
Yes. Do you have some questions? Est-ce que vous avez des questions? N'hésitez pas, oui.
So, what does it take for a French company, for example, to register for Connected Trust? What are the entry requirements that you have?
You have to be registered with the Chamber of Commerce, so the local Chamber of Commerce, so you need to be a registered organization. We sometimes see, for example, we have some French organizations who use their Dutch subsidiary as their main entry point and then go back to the headquarters in abroad as well. So for the entry part, that's not the difficult part. What we find is the most difficult one is that the laws on vulnerability management are different per country. So for example, if I would share the work the Dutch Institute for Vulnerability Disclosure does in the Netherlands is not allowed in Belgium, for example. So if I'm sharing something which is being obtained by a Dutch organization in Belgium, which would be illegal to obtain under Belgium law, am I then in potential trouble legally? No. So what we see is that in some countries, so for example, a company would rather register through the Dutch subsidiary to avoid us being challenged, or accept the fact that we share under Dutch law. That's the other alternative. So we find we doing the pilot with EXO. So we have 10 organizations from Poland, Hungary, all over the place, just to test which boundaries are there. We find they're much more legal than they are actually on the content. The registration part on that end is easy. We have somebody from Poland getting in, no problem. We have somebody in from France and from Italy, and especially the Italian one is a critical infrastructure one. But it's about legal. It's not the process.